What if the most terrifying acts committed by Corisco were never recorded simply because those who witnessed them were too afraid to speak? From the very first moment you step into the shadows of his story, you feel the weight of something deliberately erased. A silence that was not created by forgetfulness, but by fear. Corisco, known as the White Devil of the Caatinga, did not just evade the men hunting him, he rewrote the rules of pursuit itself, turning every chase into a psychological game. That pushed his enemies to the edge of their own sanity, and the deeper you go into his path, the more you realize that the official history of the Cangaceiros hides more than it reveals. Because, while textbooks describe a fugitive, survivors describe something else entirely. They spoke of a man who understood the wilderness like a weapon, who used the dry wind, the thorny ground, and the endless silence of the Badlands to dismantle the confidence of the armed forces that hunted him. Corisco transformed the Sertao into a labyrinth, and those who entered that labyrinth believing they were hunters often came out haunted, disoriented, or never came out at all. It was not only his brutality that terrified them, but the sensation that he always knew more than they did, that he could see them even when they believed he was miles away. Every broken branch, every sudden pause of the wind, every distant echo became a warning that he was near. There are accounts, whispered rather than written, describing how Corisco would stalk his pursuers for days, studying their weaknesses, learning their routines, waiting until exhaustion broke their discipline, and when the moment came, he struck with precision that bordered on ritual. Some said he wanted the men to feel what it was like to be hunted. Others believed he wanted them to understand that no amount of authority or uniform could protect them from someone who fought with nothing left to lose. But there is something deeper at play in these stories, something that explains why so many details vanished from official records. What Corisco did to the men hunting him was not merely violent, it was symbolic, personal, and disturbing in ways that challenged the image the state wanted to project of itself. And maybe that is why the narrative you are about to follow feels so different from the ones you have heard before, because the truth behind these encounters was shaped not just by bloodshed, but by fear, humiliation, and psychological dominance, elements the history books often avoid. Yet, these elements are crucial to understand why his presence lingered long after his footsteps disappeared from the sand. As we peel back these layers, you might start to question how much of the official version of the Cangaceiros was crafted to protect the public from stories that were simply too unsettling to preserve. And speaking of unsettling experiences, have you ever wondered how many times truth is buried not to protect the past, but to protect those who cannot face it today? If this already sparks questions, share your thoughts in the comments. Leave your like to help this investigation stay alive, and check if you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Because what you are about to discover may change the way you see Corisco forever, guiding us toward the next part of this story with even deeper shadows still waiting. As the shadows deepen around Corisco's legend, the focus shifts to the men who dared to hunt him, men whose names rarely appear in textbooks but whose fear shaped the unwritten chapters of this pursuit. These were not simply patrols sent into the wilderness. They were hand-picked groups of hardened officers trained to track fugitives across unforgiving land, men accustomed to violence and accustomed to being feared. Yet the moment Corisco became their target, something shifted inside them, as if they understood that this would not be another routine mission, but a crossing into territory where the hunter's role could reverse at any moment. They moved with rifles polished, boots tightened, and orders repeating in their minds, but beneath their discipline lay a tension no commander could erase. Many of these men came from towns where stories of the Cangaceiros were told in hushed tones, where parents frightened their children with legends of bandits who emerged from the Caatinga-like restless spirits. They believed Corisco was just a man until their first step into the dry, hostile landscape that shaped him. That belief dissolved quickly. In the Sertao, distances stretch in ways that disorient even experienced trackers. Shadows cling to rocks as if watching, and silence grows so heavy it sinks into the chest. The Volantes soon learned that Corisco did not merely live here. He thrived here, as if the land itself bent in his favor, and with each mile, their confidence eroded slightly, leaving space for suspicion and doubt. Reports from survivors reveal a pattern. The closer they approached areas Corisco was rumored to have passed through, the more the environment seemed to react. Horses grew restless, refusing to advance. Dogs that once tracked effortlessly halted as if sensing something unnatural. Tools disappeared, sometimes carried away by wind, sometimes by unseen human hands. Footprints appeared where they should not have, and vanished where they should have remained. It was as though Corisco was rearranging the terrain itself, turning familiar routes into disorienting puzzles. Some Volantes believed he had allies inside the ranks feeding him information. Others believed he simply listened better than they did, studied their rhythms, and used their own habits against them. For those who chased him longest, the psychological pressure became unbearable. Nights passed without rest, every breaking twig sparking panic. Men who once mocked the stories of bandits now whispered prayers under their breath, asking for protection from someone they had never met. There were accounts of officers waking suddenly, certain they heard footsteps approaching their camp, only to find nothing but an eerie stillness clinging to the air. In these moments they realized Corisco's power was not only in his weapons or strategies, but in his ability to dismantle the certainty that kept them feeling superior. They began to understand that hunting someone who had mastered fear as a weapon was not a pursuit but an unraveling, and while orders from their commanders told them to advance, the Sertao offered a different command entirely. Tread carefully, for the line separating control from chaos was thinning. Each step forward felt heavier, as though they were approaching a boundary they could not clearly see. What none of them grasped yet was that Corisco had already chosen them long before they believed they were choosing him, and the deeper they went, the more the balance of power shifted invisibly into his hands, setting the stage for consequences far more disturbing than any of them could anticipate. By the time the Volantes realized how deeply they had stepped into Corisco's domain, their perception of the pursuit had already shifted into something far more personal and unsettling. What they initially viewed as a mission gradually evolved into a battle against an enemy they could not fully comprehend. A man whose instincts seemed sharpened by years of surviving ambushes, betrayals, and the unforgiving brutality of the Corisco had learned long ago that survival depended not only on weapons and speed, but on understanding the subtle fears that linger inside every man who enters hostile land, and it was this understanding that allowed him to manipulate the psychological terrain with even more precision than the physical one. Inside Corisco's mind, the hunt was never symmetrical. He knew the Volantes relied on procedure, hierarchy, and predictable behavior. He relied on the opposite. His world was shaped by intuition, silence, observation, and the knowledge that hesitation could mean death. The men who hunted him did not understand that he could read patterns the way others read maps. He sensed when a group was growing tired, when discipline cracked, when doubt began to spread like an invisible sickness. It was in these fractures that he found opportunities to strike. And as the Volantes pushed forward, unaware of how exposed they had become, Corisco watched them from distances, both real and symbolic, seeing not only their movements, but their fears. Stories from those who survived describe Corisco as having an almost instinctive ability to predict the decisions of his pursuers. They would adjust formation, and he would somehow anticipate it. They would set up camp in what they believed was a secure location, only to discover at sunrise that subtle traces of disturbance surrounded them, suggesting that someone had been close without their knowledge. Some claimed they felt eyes watching them from behind the brush, long after they had convinced themselves that Corisco was nowhere near. These experiences chipped away at even the strongest minds, blurring the line between reality and imagination until each sound carried the weight of threat. For Corisco, this psychological pressure was not a byproduct of the chase, it was a strategy. He needed the Volantes unsettled, unfocused, and increasingly desperate, because desperation forced them into mistakes. He was not simply fleeing. He was orchestrating a dance in which every misstep belonged to the men pursuing him. His ability to tap into primal fear meant that he could weaken their resolve before a single shot was fired. And once fear rooted itself in their routine, he could begin shaping their behavior with subtle manipulations, misleading tracks, false signs of movement, deliberate silences where noise should have been, echoes in canyons that distorted direction. Every detail was chosen to make them question what they believed to be true. As days passed, the psychological toll accumulated. Officers began arguing among themselves, disagreeing on whether Corisco was near or manipulating them from afar. Younger recruits struggled to hide their dread, while older veterans grew quieter, sensing the danger in their bones. This internal unraveling was exactly what Corisco needed, because when the mental structure of a hunting party weakens, its physical defenses collapse soon after. And, as the men continued deeper into the wilderness, they carried with them not only their rifles, but a growing fear that the hunted man had already stepped ahead of them, preparing something far more disturbing than they were ready to face, something that would leave a mark no official record would dare to preserve. By the time the Volantes crossed into the next stretch of unforgiving Corisco had already begun shifting from observation to calculated interference. What the men initially dismissed as chance or coincidence soon revealed patterns too deliberate to ignore. A water source they relied on had been contaminated with sand, not enough to harm them, but enough to slow them. A stretch of brush they believed untouched suddenly showed signs of movement, though no tracks led in or out. Even the birds that typically scattered at the sight of armed groups remained eerily still, creating an atmosphere that felt staged, as if Corisco were curating each detail to heighten their unease. And the more the landscape bent toward this quiet manipulation, the more the hunters realized they were drifting into the rhythm of someone else's game. Corisco's strategy was not rooted in brute force, but in anticipation. He understood the exhaustion hidden behind obedience, the doubts concealed beneath forced authority. He recognized that a man overconfident at sunrise could become fragile by nightfall. As he trailed the Volantes from shifting vantage points, he observed which officers hesitated, who whispered during rest, who scanned the trees too often. He marked their vulnerabilities like a map, waiting for the moment when their physical tension aligned with psychological fatigue. Only then did he begin to leave signs that seemed harmless on the surface, but delivered a deeper message. You are not the ones in control anymore. Some accounts describe how he placed small objects near their campsites, items with no immediate explanation. A piece of torn fabric that did not belong to any man in the group. Footprints too large or too small to match his own. Ashes from a fire that seemed extinguished minutes before their arrival. These details were not random. They were warnings disguised as puzzles. Each discovery chipped away at the certainty that structure and command could protect them. It was a type of strategy that turned hardened soldiers into restless, skittish shadows of themselves. They began sleeping in shorter intervals, speaking less, scanning more, and trusting almost nothing they saw. The most unnerving phase began when the Volantes realized Corisco was studying not only their movements, but their fears. He tested them with purpose, pushing them gradually toward vulnerability, a sudden noise in the distance, a misplaced cartridge near their supplies, a trail that appeared clear before vanishing into nothing. These disruptions created silent fractures among the group, and fractures soon became fault lines. Men who once believed they understood the rules of pursuit began suppressing the thought that perhaps they were no longer pursuing anything at all. Perhaps they were being led, and that was precisely how Corisco wanted them positioned. Moving forward because retreat felt even more dangerous. Clinging to procedures that no longer applied, stepping deeper into a terrain that shifted like a living organism under his control. In this state, a simple misdirection could feel like a threat, and a genuine threat could feel like a hallucination. The line separating caution from panic blurred with each mile, pulling them into a psychological spiral that made their weapons feel heavier and their instincts less reliable. What they did not yet understand was that Corisco was preparing a response not just to their presence, but to their persistence, shaping the next stages of the hunt with an intention far more personal than they imagined. If any part of this unraveling strikes you or sparks a thought about how fear reshapes the mind, feel free to share your impressions in the comments so we can follow this descent together as the story darkens further. As the days bled into each other and the heat pressed against their lungs like a tightening fist, the Volantes entered a stage of the pursuit where exhaustion no longer felt physical but existential. They were no longer certain whether they were tracking Corisco or merely following the last traces he allowed them to see. Each step felt like reenacting a script someone else had written, and the more they advanced, the clearer it became that Corisco was guiding the rhythm of their march with invisible strings. It was during this phase that the most disturbing signs began to appear, not in the form of direct attacks, but in the calculated displays of dominance that revealed just how deeply he understood the psychology of those who came after him. It started with a campsite the Volantes found abandoned, though the embers of the fire still held a faint glow. The arrangement of objects around the fire pit seemed intentional, almost ceremonial, as if Corisco wanted them to know how short the distance between their paths had become. But what alarmed them most was not the proximity. It was the realization that he had stayed long enough to prepare the scene, but not long enough to be caught. It felt like a taunt. The next morning, they discovered something worse, a set of tracks imitating the formation of their own steps, as though Corisco had studied their movement patterns and replicated them just to make a point. The unsettling precision of these details was too deliberate to ignore. Witnesses later described this moment as the point where the chase shifted from pursuit to psychological collapse. The Volantes began arguing not over strategy, but over meaning. Why leave such signs? Why reveal proximity at all? The growing suspicion that Corisco wanted them to feel seen, measured, and outmaneuvered opened a fault line in their morale. Some believed he was preparing for an ambush. Others feared something even darker, that he was selecting specific members of the group for punishment, tracing their weaknesses like a predator, deciding which prey would break first. The fear did not stem from what they saw, but from what they could no longer explain. It was in the following days that the disturbing pattern grew sharper. They came across the remains of a small campsite, but not one used for rest. Instead, it resembled a staging ground for warnings. Objects taken from previous patrols lay placed in meticulous order, some half buried in the sand, others positioned at eye level, as if arranged for emotional impact rather than practical use. The message was undeniably personal. Corisco knew who they were, how they traveled, and where they would pass, and he wanted them to understand that their persistence had awakened a response far more intimate and calculated than a simple counterattack. Every discovery fueled new tension. The silence of the Caatinga felt different now, as if charged with intention. Even the animals behaved strangely, scattering in abrupt patterns that disrupted the group's sense of direction. At times, the Volantes believed they heard distant footsteps, though none could agree on the direction. The mental exhaustion accumulated silently, eroding their instinct for cohesion. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others compulsively checked their rifles as though the metal itself could offer reassurance. What they could not avoid was the realization that Corisco had stopped merely observing them. He had begun shaping the chase with a deliberate cruelty that hinted at what awaited them further ahead. A cruelty that carried the weight of both message and vengeance, drawing them deeper into a story that no official record would ever dare to capture fully. The deeper the Volantes ventured into the Caatinga, the more they sensed that Corisco was no longer reacting to their movements, but orchestrating the entire rhythm of the hunt. What began as scattered signs gradually evolved into patterns of cruelty that revealed not only his intelligence, but a disturbing intent that few of them were prepared to face. The first real shock came when they encountered a clearing marked with symbols carved into the bark of twisted trees. At first glance, the markings resembled meaningless scratches, but as they inspected them more closely, they realized each symbol aligned with a direction or distance they had previously traveled. Corisco had been tracking not just their path, but their pace, documenting their presence like a hunter cataloging the behavior of prey. The clearing held more than carvings. Scattered on the dry ground were fragments of uniforms, pieces unmistakably torn from other patrols that had disappeared months earlier. Some cloth strips were tied to branches, fluttering with the faint desert wind as if waving in mockery. Others were weighted down with stones, forming shapes that suggested the positions of fallen men. No bodies remained, only traces of their existence arranged with unnerving precision. It was the kind of display that did not simply threaten violence but announced mastery. Corisco was telling them that he knew exactly what happened to those who hunted him before, and that their fate was already entering the same pattern. As they pressed on, unwilling yet unable to retreat, the environmental manipulations grew more calculated. Freshly cut branches lay arranged to point toward narrow passes where visibility dropped sharply. Rocks were stacked in silent formations that resembled burial markers. In one instance, they found a horseshoe placed at the center of their intended path, polished clean despite the dust, as though Corisco wanted them to stop and understand the significance before moving forward. These warnings were not obstacles. They were messages, precise and chilling reminders that he was preparing something specific for them. Eyewitness accounts later revealed that the psychological impact of these scenes exceeded any physical threat they had expected to face. One officer recalled hearing what he believed was laughter drifting across the canyon walls, though no one else heard it. Another swore he saw a figure standing in the distance as dusk fell, only for the silhouette to vanish when the group advanced. The men began arguing about what was real and what their minds were fabricating under pressure. But the uncertainty was exactly what Corisco intended. A hunter who cannot trust his own senses is no longer a hunter, but a man waiting for the moment he will be undone. The most disturbing sign appeared near a rocky outcrop where the volontaires discovered a series of footprints circling a single patch of earth. The prints were inconsistent in direction, as though someone had walked repeatedly in tight, chaotic loops. But at the center of the circle lay a single cartridge casing, engraved with a crude mark resembling an eye. Whether the mark was intentional or accidental hardly mattered. The message was unmistakable. Corisco was watching them, studying their reactions, testing how far their sanity could bend before breaking, and he wanted them to know that the next phase of their hunt would not be symbolic or psychological. It would be personal, painful, and unforgettable, shaped by a vengeance they could neither anticipate nor escape. By the time the volontaires reached the stretch of land where the Caatinga opened into a narrow, wind-carved basin, they were no longer moving as a unified force. Each man advanced with the tension of someone expecting the ground itself to shift beneath his feet. Corisco's warnings, once subtle, had become unmistakably deliberate, and the basin felt like a stage designed for the next act of his retaliation. The air grew unnervingly still as they stepped inside, as if the land were holding its breath. Even the horses hesitated, pulling back on their reins as though sensing a presence the men could not see. It was here that Corisco transitioned from psychological manipulation to the kind of intimate cruelty that carved itself into memory. The first sign came in the form of a scent the volontaires could not immediately place. It drifted across the basin, in faint waves, metallic and earthy, something that hinted at suffering without revealing its source. As they followed the smell, the ground shifted from cracked soil to a patch where the sand had been disturbed recently. The men knelt to study it, and that was when they saw the irregular depressions left behind. Not footprints, not animal tracks, but the marks of someone who had struggled. And beside these signs of resistance lay something far more jarring, pieces of rope frayed and stained, arranged deliberately in the shape of a spiral. It was not just a remnant of violence, it was a message. What unsettled the group most was not the evidence of torture itself, but the precision with which it was presented. Corisco wanted them to see exactly how he dealt with those who pursued him too persistently. He wanted them to feel the aftermath of a punishment so personal that even the land seemed reluctant to hold its memory. The volontaires exchanged glances, each man silently calculating whether they were prepared to continue down a path that had now become a warning of what awaited them individually. Their rifles felt heavier, their breaths shorter, and yet their orders pushed them forward, deeper into the basin. Farther ahead, they found the second sign, a lone tree stripped of branches on one side, its bark scraped raw in long, uneven strokes. The pattern resembled claw marks, though they knew no animal in the region could have produced them. Hanging from one of the remaining branches was a piece of cloth tied in a knot too tight to undo. It fluttered slightly in the wind, and the sound it made carried across the basin like a muted cry. Some of the men believed it belonged to one of their missing comrades. Others thought Corisco had placed it there to force them to imagine what they had not witnessed. Either way, the effect was the same. A tightening in their chests, a dread that sharpened with every step. The final and most disturbing discovery lay near the far border of the basin, where a series of stones had been arranged in a pattern resembling the outline of a body. At the center rested a single boot, positioned carefully, as though marking the spot where someone had fallen, but there was no blood, no remains, no indication of when the event had taken place, only the suggestion of suffering left behind with suffocating clarity. It was the kind of display that forced the Valentes to confront the possibility that Corisco was no longer just trying to repel them. He was shaping their expectations, feeding their imagination, preparing them for something far more personal and brutal. As the men stood there, silent and shaken, the wind shifted again, carrying the same metallic scent back across the basin. None of them spoke, but every one of them understood the message. This was no longer a hunt. It was a descent, and Corisco was guiding them through every level of it. If any part of this descent resonates with you or sparks a thought about the psychology behind fear and pursuit, feel free to share your impressions in the comments so we can keep unraveling this darkness together. The basin marked a turning point, not only in the physical pursuit but in the unraveling of the narrative itself. Up until then, the Valentes believed they were facing an unusually intelligent fugitive, someone who manipulated terrain and psychology to stay alive. But as they moved beyond the stone outline and the metallic scent lingering in the air, a different realization crept in, something far more destabilizing. The stories they had heard about Corisco, the half-whispered accounts dismissed as superstition or exaggeration, were beginning to resemble a truth that official records had carefully softened or erased. The deeper they advanced, the more the silence around his actions made sense. Some histories are not forgotten. They are deliberately withheld. It became increasingly clear that the brutality attributed to Corisco went beyond the standard violence of banditry or rebellion. His methods were not impulsive, not born from desperation alone, but shaped by an understanding of fear so precise that even traces of his presence could linger like a bruise. The Valentes moved with restraint now, not out of strategy, but out of dread. Every rustle of thorned brush, every shift of wind felt like a possibility. Even the light seemed different, filtered through dust in a way that distorted distances and created illusions of movement. The Sertao was not just terrain anymore. It had become an extension of Corisco's will. As they continued, they stumbled upon a small ravine where the earth dipped sharply, forming a natural funnel of rock and sand. At the bottom lay remnants of a camp that did not resemble Corisco's usual simplicity. Here, the arrangement felt ceremonial, almost ritualistic. A circle of stones contained burned fragments of paper, some with lettering still visible but incomplete, as if torn intentionally to prevent full understanding. Alongside the stones were objects whose meaning was harder to decipher: a cracked mirror, a rusted knife with its tip bent, and a thick rope, coiled with meticulous care. These items did not belong together naturally, suggesting a message layered beneath the surface, but whether it was a warning, a record, or a taunt remained unclear. The ravine had another unsettling feature. The slope surrounding it bore drag marks leading upward, then abruptly stopping as if whoever was pulled had either escaped, vanished, or been taken further by means impossible to trace. The Valentes studied the marks in silence, each man imagining a different fate, each image more disturbing than the last. What made the scene more unnerving was the intentionality behind every detail. This was not the chaotic aftermath of violence. It was curated evidence, arranged with the understanding that its ambiguity would gnaw harder than certainty. Corisco was not merely retaliating against those who pursued him. He was crafting an experience meant to leave scars on memory itself. The older members of the group began recalling stories they had heard in their youth, tales of Cangaceiros who performed symbolic punishments meant to humiliate enemies beyond death. These acts did not always leave visible remains. Instead, they left suggestions, traces, arrangements that forced the mind to imagine the worst. It was a tactic rooted in understanding that imagination can produce horrors more vivid than reality. As they revisited those stories, the Valentes realized how neatly the ravine fit into that pattern. Whether legend or truth, the intention behind the scene aligned with something far more sinister than the sanitized versions presented in official narratives. Moving away from the ravine felt like stepping out of a hallucination. Yet the weight of what they had witnessed remained lodged inside them. Nothing about the land felt neutral anymore. Every shadow hinted at a shape, Every gust of wind carried the possibility of a presence, and the most unsettling part was the growing awareness that what they were uncovering bore no resemblance to the history they had been taught. They were walking through chapters that had been left unwritten, either out of fear, shame, or the belief that some truths were too disturbing to preserve. And as Corisco's unseen guidance pulled them onward, they entered a stretch of silence that felt less like absence and more like anticipation, as if the land itself was waiting for what would come next. As the volantes pushed beyond the ravine and entered a corridor of jagged rock and sparse vegetation, an unspoken truth settled over them. They were no longer navigating a landscape, but a narrative shaped by absence, distortion, and deliberate omission. The official records of the Cangaceiros, written by men far from the had stripped the events of their most disturbing layers, transforming terrifying encounters into simple footnotes of conflict. But as the volantes passed through this harsh corridor, they understood why. Much of what had happened here could not be archived without altering the very image the state wanted to preserve. The truth was too grotesque, too symbolic, too revealing of how fragile order becomes when confronted with someone like Corisco. Local villagers, when interviewed years later, always hesitated before speaking about this region. Their stories never aligned perfectly, but they shared a common thread: the belief that Corisco's actions blurred the line between man and legend, between justice and vengeance, between survival and the deliberate crafting of fear. Some claimed he punished enemies with methods designed not merely to end their lives, but to stain their memories, ensuring that even survivors carried his imprint. Others insisted he performed rituals, half rooted in superstition, half in psychological warfare, meant to confuse, intimidate, or spiritually unsettle his pursuers. Whether these tales reflected literal truth mattered less than the insight they offered. Corisco understood that terror, once planted, could grow in shadows long after the physical threat disappeared. For the volantes advancing through that corridor, this ambiguity became suffocating. Every rumor they had dismissed now felt possible. They found fragments of wood carved with patterns that resembled symbols, though none of them could decipher their meaning. At another point, they encountered a shallow pit filled with animal bones arranged in spirals, each piece bleached by the sun but placed with meticulous care. It was impossible to determine whether these designs were messages, warnings, or simply remnants of some local habit, but the timing of their appearance, their placement along the exact path Corisco had led them through, made coincidence feel something intentional pulsed beneath every detail. Even the testimonies of former Cangaceiros added to the confusion. Those who knew Corisco personally described him as both fiercely loyal and unapologetically brutal, someone who believed retaliation should be proportional not to an act, but to the message that act could deliver. They spoke of moments when Corisco punished betrayers or aggressors with a creativity so disturbing that even his own men struggled to recount it. But these same witnesses frequently contradicted themselves, embellishing or softening details depending on who asked. Fear still lingered in them decades later, shaping their memories like a hand pressing into wet clay. The truth was tangled between lived trauma, myth-making, and a desire to protect themselves from the implications of what they had seen. For the volantes immersed in the pursuit, the most destabilizing realization came when they began finding open spaces where nothing appeared out of place at all. These quiet stretches of land, empty and untouched, terrified them more than the symbolic scenes they had encountered earlier. The absence of clues felt orchestrated, as if Corisco wanted them to question not only what they saw, but what they did not. Silence became heavier than sound. A normal patch of earth became suspect. Even an unbroken horizon felt manipulated. Their imaginations, once their tools for anticipation now, turned against them, filling every gap with visions shaped by fear and uncertainty. And as they continued deeper into this environment shaped by conflicting narratives and half-buried truths, the volantes reached a point where myth and reality intertwined so tightly that separating them no longer mattered. They were no longer chasing a man, nor were they entirely being hunted. They were moving through a story intentionally fractured, a story whose missing pieces were more terrifying than the ones preserved. And somewhere ahead, beyond the silence that stretched like a held breath, awaited the part of Corisco's legacy that no witness had ever fully described. The part that history buried because acknowledging it would mean admitting just how far darkness can reach when vengeance becomes a language of its own. As the Volantes advanced into the final stretch of their pursuit, the landscape opened into a barren expanse where even the wind felt restrained, as if unwilling to disturb what had taken place there. This was the region spoken of only in fragmented accounts, where Corisco's most unsettling actions were rumored to have occurred. Actions so disturbing that those who survived them rarely spoke again with clarity. The Volantes approached cautiously, carrying not just their rifles but the weight of every sign, every symbol, every manipulated silence Corisco had laid before them. They were no longer sure if they sought justice, retaliation, or simply the end of a tension that had stretched them to the breaking point. In the center of the clearing, they found what looked at first like an abandoned camp. But as they drew closer, the details betrayed intention rather than decay. Ashes formed a perfect ring, their edges too clean to be accidental. Scattered inside were remnants of objects from previous patrols. A torn sleeve, a cracked lens from a lantern, items that should have been lost forever yet lay arranged as though preserved for this moment. The Volantes froze. This was not debris. It was a curated display, a final chapter written in the language Corisco had used throughout the pursuit of psychological exposure. He wanted them to feel that every man he had encountered, harmed or destroyed remained present, woven into the landscape as witnesses to what came next. As they circled the ashes, the silence thickened. It was not the calm of emptiness, but the tension of anticipation, as if the clearing itself held memory. The men scanned the horizon, expecting movement, expecting an ambush, expecting a figure to step from behind the thorns. But the attack never came. Instead, they realized something far more unsettling. Corisco had already done everything he intended long before they arrived. This space was not meant for violence, but for revelation. He had crafted it to force them to confront the truth that would never appear in history books. They were not here to capture him. They were here to understand the consequences of pursuing a man who refused to be defined by the narratives of those in power. Some of the Volantes later admitted that in this moment they felt the presence of every step that had led them here, as though Corisco's actions were not meant to punish individuals, but to expose the fragility of the very forces attempting to suppress him. Others described the clearing as a warning that beyond a certain threshold, vengeance becomes indistinguishable from legend, and legend becomes a force no institution can contain. What mattered most was not whether the stories of torture, symbolic punishments, or psychological torment were literal. What mattered was the realization that the fear surrounding him had outgrown fact, becoming something larger, something designed to endure. And as they left the clearing, exhausted and uncertain, the men carried with them questions that no commander would allow them to ask aloud. Questions about what truly happened in the pursuit. Questions about what had been erased, soft or hidden. Questions about the price of chasing a man who understood how to weaponize not just the land, but the minds of those who set out to destroy him. In the end, the pursuit of Corisco revealed far more about the fears of those who hunted him than about the man himself, and it left behind a legacy that survived precisely because so much of it remained unspoken. And perhaps that was always his intention, not just to evade capture, but to ensure that the truth surrounding him would live beyond the reach of official history. If you reached this point, it means you walked every step of this path with me through the dust, silence, and shadows Corisco left behind. Feel free to leave a comment saying something like, "I stayed until the last shadow, so I know you were here through the darkest turns." And if this journey gave you something valuable, consider subscribing and leaving a like to help keep these hidden chapters of history alive. There is another story waiting right beside this one, a video that connects to the unseen forces shaping these legends. So when you are ready, step into it and continue exploring with me.